Alrighty, week 7, learn together. What an important week, and actually every week from here on out will be, as it has been. So I just will give you an update that I've suggested to the campus that we teach this class in the 18-week mode as a hybrid class next semester. And I just think this compressed mode is really challenging depending on the skill that you bring to this class. So just know that that is what I'm suggesting. So where are we at? We're at week 7, and I'm just going to for a second flip over to the calendar, right? So I'm going to now where I'm recording is a week ahead of this item, which I always try to do. And so which really means from that next week when this item, hopefully you'll work on it before the due date, but if you don't see this, it's 1, and let's just do this, 2, okay, 3, so 1, 2, 3 weeks from this class being over, okay? So it's moving really quick. And so here's what I want to say is today's, and I'm going to move back to Andrew's course. I got all the way for what I'm going to show you. I got all the way through 68. So I got kind of halfway through this section, and I'm going to be okay if you do that. I definitely will finish the rest of it, but my time just didn't allow it this week. And the reason, too, I thought this is okay is the next section is a little bit lighter, but it's not so much heavy implementation details that we're going to do. It's arrow function is one I've suggested, and I know Jared had a comment back about, well, it's not fully supported, and I get that. But the point is that you're going to see arrow functions. It's a modern way to write functions, but I think this section, right, is really more of just concepts and not so much of implementation, where the section that we're working in right here is really about implementation. So if you get somewhere in the 66 to 68 range, I'm going to be okay with that. You'll need to finish it up next week. I'm not going to change the writing. I really depend on you listening to the lectures here to get that output or to get that information. There's 2 parts. You should have this week finished your implementation of your Develop It 1 code into the browser. And then, of course, implement the things kind of halfway through that section, local storage, UUID, and refactoring your code to have it in at least 2 files. Okay, so I'm going to go over what I did. I also did something in preparation for the last Develop It, which, by the way, let me just go ahead and do this as well. Let me go ahead and open this in one more tab, because before I look at this, I want you to know that I did release the draft of the Develop It 2, the last one, the requirements, okay? And if you want to check over this, I will. This is a draft. I may add 1 or 2 things to this as I kind of get closer, right? But this is the draft for what you need to create. And part of the reason I'm talking about it here is I actually did start working on my responsive design. And you might wonder, well, wait a minute, this class isn't about that. No, it's not. But it is. This class is such in the schedule that it has been planned so that you already should have had. And I know that's a hard word to hear sometimes, but you should have had HTML, CSS, some class that taught you about responsive design, either my class in 82, Todd's class in 85, or just go find out for your own, because it doesn't have to be anything complicated for this part. Okay. Matter of fact, I ended up using Flexbox for mine. Okay. And I'll show you how I did that. Okay, so that's the work you have to do. And so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about my code as a way to help you, right? So help you in prepping for your last Develop It code review. Because remember, these code reviews are intended to see, A, is your code working? And B, can you talk about it? Did you meet the requirements, and can you describe what that code's doing, right? That's a way important part. And I know these code reviews can be emotional. And I know some of you, it was like feeling very much put on the spot. It wasn't the intention, but it can happen. So the more you prep for this, the better it's going to be. Okay, so I'm going to actually show you first So here's what my current rock, scissors, paper is looking like, right? I believe it is running just to make sure. It is using local storage. And the way I can tell that is if I put in a player name who's already in there, then it brings out the history of that player. And what I did also is I did kind of some color schemes around my images that I used. I also put in showing who is a current player because for me, the idea of implementing a full authentication for this class does not make sense. But there's ways I can easily show who's playing, and all I have to do, and of course, if you were having this as a real game, you wouldn't do that, right? So if I said Jack, right? So now Jack's playing, right? So and Jack has some history. How about Jane? Jane hasn't played yet, right? So in this case, Jane's now playing, but she has no history. So if she plays, she gets the output of the game and it adds to her history, right? So this was completely fun for me to do. And again, the reason I took the step of doing some of the responsive design here was to prep me for what I know is coming because I just know my timeline is going to get short. So in this case, and by the way, if you don't know this, in the browser, you can change to where you render your site as like on a mobile device. And so now I can see that this is flexing. Part of it, it doesn't have to do a lot of, and I should say responsive to whatever device it's on. So it's going to look different on an iPad, of course, than it would look on a Pixel phone, let's say, right? So this is using local storage. I've implemented UUID. I don't have the target of the UUID yet. I'll do that next, but I've already talked about that. If you get halfway through this section implementing this, it's fine, do it next week, but you're going to have to do all of them. And by the way, the other thing about the develop it too, so now that I'm thinking about this, I'll go ahead and say this, is that the last section 10, those concepts in section 10 will not be part of the last develop it. I just want you to have been exposed to them. Now, having said that, and I know the colors here are not great, I want to say this again, right? So our develop it twos, the last day you can do reviews for this are going to be the 2nd. I'm sorry, for the second one is the 10th of October. Okay. And I fly out on that morning, the next morning. So I'm going to be gone. And I have right now, and I've already started the setup for the code review sessions that will start on that Monday, but they could start the prior week as well, right? Remember, these is just a way to have us get organized. I haven't released them yet, but I will tell you, if you see me the week before, that's fine as well. Like if you were talking to me on the 3rd, because the one thing about this is the sooner you come and talk to me, that I can give you some, if you need help on your code or if you wanted to just talk about what I would want to hear in a code review, I mean, any of that, you are more than welcome to do it. Okay, so hopefully that gives you, at least for now, some of that. So I'm going to move over to my editor. And I have open, and I'm going to actually close down. I ended up doing, and by the way, be careful when you're watching about the UUID. I actually just brought the file down like you recommended because the reference that he's talking about doing in the script didn't work for my purposes. So I'm just going to close that down because I don't need it. And then I did do some CSS, some simple stuff. I just set up CSS for the all of these things, main, header, section, aside, and footer fall with and give these CSS properties. And then specifically on my main, I did some things, but here's where I use Flexbox. Again, this is stuff that we'd hoped you come in with. It doesn't have to be really complicated there, but we can talk CSS maybe more later. So for me, then really this is the other part of this, is that you want to break this into 2 files. Now I have my first app file and then I have my functions file. And I think that's a great idea. So in here, I'm setting up some constants that are actually doing document get element by ID for all the areas in the document that I'm going to need to reference. And the reason I do that is so that my code's not so wordy. Okay, so, and then I set up, and by this idea of let player, I'm actually going to end up getting rid of this and just passing it around, which makes more sense. And here's where you start to see the implementation of the local storage. So I'm setting a variable called gameplay details, which is capturing every play occurrence, and it is actually it's the result of going and calling get save data game detail, which is over here. And this is where this is almost identical to what he wrote, where I'm checking to see if there is, and I called my key in local storage RPS. If something comes back, then I reparse that, because remember what's happening in local storage is you have to parse it because you stringify it before you do that, and that's really just the way things are in local storage. And if you don't find anything, then I just return an empty string. That is really then what happens if I have no history or nothing setting in local storage. Okay, so this will return different based on if I have things in local storage or not. So unlike Andrew, I ended up using images, and I used a input field for my event listeners, right? So event listeners is the idea is that you're listening for some kind of activity. In this case, a click event, a click event, a click event, right? And then in this case for the player, it's a change event whenever you put in a new player's name. And then I ended up adding another event listener here for the input. And let me show you why I did that. And so actually, let me drop this out as well here and just refresh the page. So first, the reason I did this is if you put in, if you tried to play without putting a name in, it gives you a message. Okay. And that's why I did that. And so when you come back into the field, right, I did an input event listener so that as soon as you try to enter a new one, that error message would go away. And that's where you really want to think through how you're going to handle the user input. Okay. So that's why I have this input, this event listener on that player name, so that whenever you click into there, you get that cleared out. Okay, so I'll just walk through one of my, well, actually, let's walk through player, right? So when you enter a player name, again, if there's nothing in there, when you move out of the field, then it's going to give you the error message. Otherwise, it's going to convert the e.target value, which is the value of that field, to lowercase and then store it on player, which is really the reference here back on the global namespace, which I am going to change. I'm not going to need that on the global namespace. And really, you should have very few things setting out defined on the global namespace if you can. And so the reason I'm saying the current player HTML, and that's really where it's showing who the current player is right here. Right here, the reason I'm clearing that is if somebody there was some content back in there when the new player was entered, so it clears it before we actually set up the new element, the create element. So document.create element, I'm creating new element in H2. I set that H2 to a string value, and then I say current player dot append child. So current player, if you scroll up, is the idea here of current player is pointing to that. Let's see, where is current player pointing? I just have to remember where it's going. So it's an H2. So this is the now playing I was talking about before. So once that's done, then I call render game detail, and I pass into it gameplay detail, which is on the global space. So I actually could have not passed this, although the nice thing about maybe doing this, and he talks about this a little bit, is it makes your code when you want to use this function in the future with something different, you can, besides, let's say, game all the detail. And then I pass in the filter and I pass in the player. So now this is calling one of my functions inside of my function file. Remember, even though you have two files, it's all part of the same namespace. Okay, so let me come down here. So here is this idea of how to render that gameplay detail. I clear what was maybe in there in the player history before if there was something setting in there, because every time this is called, I want a new list. I set up an H1, and that H1 is here. This is the telling the game, the player and the gameplay history, okay, up here. And then I append that into the DOM by looking, or because I'm targeting player history, that place in the DOM with that ID. And then I'm filtering through all the gameplay for this specific player. Okay, that's what filtered player means, that I'm looking through. Remember, if when I'm doing a filter, I'm iterating over each of those. And then what each of those would be referenced would be the detail, right? And then I'm returning if my player, the detail of each one is equal to what I'm passing in. Okay. And then if the player history is the length is none, just output a message that says there's no player history. That's what I showed you when I had a new player. And then else, assuming there is some content in there, I'm going to take that new filtered player array, that array of objects, and I'm going to I'm going to iterate over. I'm going to have the game as each individual object in that array, and the index being which one it's pointing to. And then I'm just going to set up a new p value. I'm going to create a template string. I added 1 to the index because we know arrays are 0 indexed, that we would want to add 1. So I'd want to say game 1, game 2, and so on. And that's the idea here of those. And so now that is what I append down into the player history. Okay. So that's the code that generates the player history and responds once the event listener for the player. The gameplay itself is actually triggered off of the event listeners for each of the images, right? So there's an event listener on each of these, which, by the way, I want to show you. You can always right click on anything, hit inspect, and then come down and inspect and hit event listener, and you can see the event listener, and you'll see each of them, in my case, have an event listener. Now, the reason it's nice to see here is you can see how that's set up, and it gives you, so if you're just wondering, well, how is that working? What is it doing? That ability right there is a great thing to have. So I have 3 event listeners for each one of those graphics. And then if they don't put in if they click, right? If they click, they don't have a player name, I give them a message. Otherwise, I call play game with the player and with the selection that they have. Now, this is code we've seen of mine before, but just briefly, just to give you how this is working, right? So I'm going to go down because it's going to call play game, passing in the player and the player choice, right? So again, the idea of I'm passing arguments that become parameters, and then I can name them differently, right? In this case, I think it was scissors I was looking at. So the first thing I do is I'm going to output the gameplay results. I go ahead and clear that in case there's something setting out there. I generate the game choice. I then go play the game. Again, this is code I've walked you through. But now what I do, this is probably the new stuff, is I set up an H1, because the result of playing the game, right? So I have the game choice and the player choice, right? Because the player choice has been selected or determined by which one you click. And then the game choice is random. The player choice is by what you click. And then we're going to update, right? So that's where when you play, this happens. And notice again how I kind of color coded them. The designer came out in me for a minute. And then what I do here is I render. So once the game is played, then I render a game detail again, so that, and this is where, I could do a better job, and I will, of actually passing around that filtered data, because I don't really need to go through this again. I've already done it once. So, but this is an event listener, and that other would have, anyway, I could get into the detail weeds here, but I just want you to see, right? So that is me going through it in a little bit more detail and showing you kind of some of the stuff I'd want to hear when you're talking about this. You need to be thinking about how you're going to handle the user input, right? Because if the user gives you because you cannot count on the user giving you what you want. You actually have to, and in this case, handle any errors. And we'll learn a little later about error handling, but it's pretty easy in what we have so far to do that. Okay, longer than it normally is, but let me know if that was helpful in going through that in a little more detail. Thanks, and I'll talk to you later.